Drew Hannush, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here and get a chance to just chat about things instead of me grilling people with questions about whiskey.
But I have to say, it is always entertaining to listen to you grill people about whiskey because an absolute pleasure. So today we are talking about The Quiet Man because Erin Gabra, I might be mispronouncing that. Irish people, feel free to shoot me a message. But it is St. Patrick's Day. And what is more apropos for Americans to do than St. Patrick's Day than talk about Irish whiskey and watch The Quiet Man?
Yeah, there you go. Which actually has not really been a tradition for me. I will be honest, I did not see The Quiet Man. The Quiet Man was my dad's favorite movie.
Oh, really?
Yes, and it kind of saddens me that I never really watched it with him because it would have been interesting to see his reactions to it and what he enjoyed about it and the rest. So I only came to it recently. My
What was the first
John
time you
Wayne.
watched it?
What's that?
When did you first watch The Quiet Man?
First time I watched it fully through was maybe 2 months ago when I posted on Instagram. Yeah, that's the first time I actually
Wow.
had seen it in its entirety. I'd seen parts of it, but I hadn't seen the entire thing. So it was a treat to watch it because I will say after I watched it, I got into a John Wayne mood, and I
Oh,
just started going.
good.
Yeah, I started going back and watching John Wayne movies that I'd never seen before, and I like to say my favorite John Wayne movies are movies like The Searchers. I love The Searchers.
Gorgeous movie.
Yeah. Well, it's not only that. Well, there's a moment in that movie that really stands out to me, and it's the moment when they come back to the ranch and something bad has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And when they come out, they don't show the gruesome scene. They just act and give the performance, and it's more chilling that way to me. To see blood and guts all over the place is one thing, but to let the imagination kind of take off and go in its own direction, I thought was really effective, and it's part of the reason why I feel like I need to go back and watch more of those John Ford era
Mm-hmm.
movies that I haven't seen. And my favorite John Wayne movie is, it's funny, it's not a movie where John Wayne is the star. He's
Oh,
actually
really?
he's actually a secondary character, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Oh my goodness, is that a good movie?
Yeah, I love that movie. I mean, I just watched that a couple weeks ago. I saw it came on Amazon Prime, and I said, okay, I'm going to watch it again. I can watch that many, many times and never get tired of it.
That's one of those movies that I would in watching The Quiet Man, one of the things that struck me was this is actually a really good performance from John Wayne. Like in terms of him having like just not walking on stage and kind of being he's always walking on stage being John Wayne.
Yeah, right. He
But
he has that little shimmy he does when he walks.
the swagger, I think that he really does give a fairly nuanced performance in this film, despite it being very broadly John Wayne.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, okay, what are the top John Wayne performances? I know he got the Oscar for True Grit, but genuinely, I think that Ethan in The Searchers,
Mm.
and then Donovan, is that his name in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance?
Yeah,
I'm trying to
yeah,
remember.
yeah, yeah,
Those are the other two like high watermark performances of John Wayne just getting to chew the scenery and
yeah,
act.
yeah. Well, and he becomes a subtle hero in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and that's why I like him, because he's not. He doesn't. I mean, he's definitely out front in Quiet Man. I mean, he is commanding the whole thing, but he takes
Mm-hmm.
a step back in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Which for Jimmy Stewart to be the lead compared to
Yeah,
the Duke is part of what makes that film different.
yeah,
Because if for anyone that hasn't seen it, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, A, you need to watch it, and B, Jimmy Stewart is the guy that you remember from uh, It's a Wonderful Life.
yeah,
He's not an imposing, threatening presence. It's like we've got one end of the spectrum, and then there's John Wayne on the other end.
yeah. He's the weakling intellectual that comes into town and is trying to bring down Western craziness by using the law.
Hmm.
And in the end, he has to end up facing the reality of what the West is to be able to even get a foothold in it. So it's really interesting to follow that, and to it's one of those movies like Psycho too. I'm going to draw a weird correlation here, where the main scene, the thing
Hmm.
that's like the apex of the film, actually happens in the middle of the movie, not at the
Yeah.
end of the movie. And then it kind of takes a long resolve
Hmm.
after that, which I think is a very interesting way of making films. I like films that surprise you in one way or another. And, I mean, we have enough movies that you can sit back and relax and just dumb down and, you know, take the journey. But sometimes it's nice to have something weird happen that makes you
Hmm.
go, oh, okay. And it's funny, even when I go back and I was watching Liberty Valance, I had forgotten that scene happened in the middle of the movie, when he faces off against Lee Marvin. So, and there's another great actor, to
Oh
be
yeah.
stuck in that. It's just a great Western. And again, it gets me to want to watch more of those as I go along. But it's funny, as I was watching Quiet Man, I was sitting there thinking, they couldn't make this movie today.
No,
I
no,
can't
they
see
couldn't.
Bradley Cooper playing the John, you know?
So, first and foremost, before we get into the Quiet Man, I just want to
Yeah.
say, shout out. You have published Experiencing Irish Whiskey, your travel guide to distilleries of Ireland. And it's a phenomenal read, not only because this isn't just the travel guide where it dumps you in, here are the places to go. You actually give a wonderful setup to that with, okay, here's the background and the history. Here is how to properly like get the most out of a whiskey tasting experience here. And I have to say, I just appreciate the fact that it's a more holistic book
Yeah.
instead of just being a conventional, here is your map, here are like the profiles, and go at it. You even talk about how to set up the travel trip.
Yeah. Well, to me, these books came about because I had started doing a podcast, and then I was at a podcast convention, and there was a person there that was talking about self-publishing books and said, if you can teach somebody something, you should write a book about it. And I thought, I'd already written a outline and done a travel blog about Kentucky and how to do a Kentucky bourbon trip. And so it was really interesting because I was actually on a trip out to Montana while I was doing my travel fuels life stuff. And I just had a couple days to drive through Glacier National Park and was just taking in the scenery. But I brought my little mini recorder with me, and I wrote an outline of how should you plan out a trip. And then I just kind of talked it through to myself, came home and wrote the book with the idea of what questions would I have, what problems did I run into in terms of travel. And then when doing the Irish book, it was actually, now I can add in how to do European travel, because there's so many more considerations that you need to take, and you got to learn how to drive on the left side of the road, and or decide that you're not going to do that, and then how are you going to get around. So this book took on, it's a little thicker than the other one, even though it has less profiles in it, because it really does dive a little bit deeper into travel and figuring out how to get through all of that. And it's funny because my sister and I are going to Spain, and she said, I don't know what I need to put together for this trip. And I said, well, just look inside the Irish whiskey book. I have a checklist on how to get around, what you need to take with you and what you need to prep for. So yeah, it's fun putting it together.
Well, it's a delightful read. I encourage everyone to get a copy, and of course, we will have it in the show notes. Uh, when you seen you had seen the Quiet Man before you went on this trip to Ireland, right?
No, I saw it on the way.
Oh,
I know. And see, this is what was fun about this, was that I went to afterwards, I went to see where this was filmed, because it was such beautiful scenery.
hmm.
And I said, I wonder if I was near there, because I went by some beautiful, beautiful places. And I did. I had driven through there. And in fact, it was the place that when I came home, I said, that is one of the most beautiful places I've been. I've been to Isle of Skye. I love Isle of Skye in Scotland. And that's hard to beat. But if anything could get close to it, it's this little area of Ireland on the west coast or near the west coast, and it's just north of Galway, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful area. And it's really interesting because as you're driving through, you see the lake over here, you see a mountain range which has more kind of darker tone greens, and then over here is much more of your vibrant green. So just in doing a 360, you're getting different vibes from like old kind of an old world feel to this is fresh and new, and everything, is it's springtime and everything's growing. So um interesting. I don't know how they found that little town for doing this, but it was an absolutely perfect spot. And in fact, there's a scene in that movie that I think is kind of as part of the plot. It's a frustrating part of the film because he's having trouble with his wife, and he goes on this big long 5
So
mile walk
if we can, I want us to kind of walk through the movie.
through the movie. Okay,
Through the
okay,
movie. So we'll get there. But I
yeah,
think it's awesome that you got a chance to see it, to actually be in that spot. Because I was thinking, if you didn't see The Quiet Man beforehand,
yeah.
oh, wouldn't it be painful to have missed out on getting to see that, because it's just such a gorgeous,
Yeah,
gorgeous location. But let's kind of walk our way through the movie here.
okay.
The film is directed by John Ford. This is one of his third director Oscar wins,
Mm,
which is absolutely worth it. And then also it won the Oscar for cinematography,
which
which
I can see.
I can see. So I have like the Blu-ray special edition, and I threw that in. And just when a film is from the 50s and it still just looks amazing on screen.
Well, Technicolor, I don't know why. It's kind of like when you do these Instagram filters and you're pumping up the contrast of colors and creating more saturation. I think that's what we get out of Technicolor, is it just makes everything seem more vibrant than it probably really is. So
So the film opens, John Wayne gets off the train, and he is in Ireland. He is ready. He's looking for Innisfree, and he's instantly mobbed by everyone at the little
I laugh so much at this movie because there are points like
extra
that.
characters.
Yeah, and they're so good.
They
They,
do an
they,
amazing job. Every one of them has a little bit. The one guy's like, "Oh, I tell you how to get to Innisfree, but I have to drive the train."
yeah, you're right, right. Or you look over there and see, go where you see over there. Yeah, don't go that way. And then somebody just steals his bags, and he's like, "Okay, and it's free this way."
Barry Fitzgerald plays Michelino Flynn, who's kind of just the guide who takes John Wayne to Innisfree. And along the way, I was watching this movie. I'm like, I have never watched this movie and just realized John Wayne looks so enormous compared to everyone else on screen. Like, I
Yeah,
knew he was a big guy, but he looks towering over these tiny Irish people.
it's funny too. I got that same experience when I went to Mexico. I remember being at a bus station in Mexico, and there was a woman standing next to me. She had to be all of maybe 4'3". I think she was looking up at me like, "Holy cow!" A glance says a million things. But you're right. We don't think about certain actors, Tom Cruise, Al Pacino, short actors,
Mhm.
and what camera angles will do. And maybe John Ford wanted to accent by camera angles this American. Well, we're not supposed to know why he's there or who he is, which I think is again one of those things that I love about this movie,
It's a
is
soft
that
mystery.
it is we don't know why he's there. We're kind of confused as to, I mean, we know his family's from there, but why is he coming back? And you know it's funny, they call him the quiet man, but in reality he's talking through the whole movie. So he's not, but he's being quiet on the reason he's there,
Mhm.
which I think is a very interesting piece.
There's actually a whiskey called the Quiet Man,
Yes.
and I correct me if I'm wrong. It's because there is like a phrase in Ireland that means like a quiet man, someone who's just a little silent.
That I don't know. I will say I didn't wear it because I can't wear headphones over the top of it, but I have a quiet man
Oh, the cap.
cap. Yeah. I bought it at Blarney Castle.
Oh,
I
that's
was
awesome.
I was like, I've always wanted a flat cap, and now I got one, and it says The Quiet Man inside of it. So it was actually branded off of that movie, which is very interesting.
John Wayne's style in this movie is really spot on. Like again, little things that I didn't pick up on before, but just he's got that tie that he's wearing along with the sweater vest. He's wearing this gorgeous tweed jacket. Just I was Googling tweed jackets as I'm watching the movie. I'm like, the problem is I know no matter how close I get to the actual thing on the screen, I still don't look like John Wayne, so I won't look like
That's
John Wayne wearing
well,
it.
I have this thing with I try not to obsess over clothes, but if you watch the movie Casino Royale, when they first arrive in Carlo Viveri, where the casino is, he has on a blue shirt that it really got me into wearing blue shirts, but his has such a fine stripe in it. It is
Mm-hmm.
so subtle. And I have looked everywhere for that shirt and I cannot find that shirt. I've found ties that look like his ties, but I haven't been able to find the shirt. So that's another Ford, Tom Ford. We have to check his catalog, I
Oh
guess.
dear goodness, someday we do have to do a movie that's like just the Tom Ford best because Quantum of Solace is a crappy movie, but Daniel Craig looks amazing. That's the first film that Tom Ford did the apparel for, I think.
Okay, you're gonna you'll we'll have to disagree on that one because I love Quantum of Solace.
I
That's
I
my
have I have a soft spot for it. Just the story structure
yeah. No,
hurts.
I get that, but I always watch it as a conclusion to Casino
Casino
Royale.
Royale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So hey, you guys, audience, you know that Drew and I will do Quantum of Solace eventually.
Yeah.
So they go over that little bridge, which is one of those moments that I think actually works well in the aging because you can tell it's like a backdrop,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it still looks okay. Like it has that charming feel to it, not
This is
the this looks kind of bad and chintzy.
this is the hard part about, like, for instance, during the horse race. Now we'll get to that later on, but just cinematography from that time period where you can tell by the lighting on the
Mm-hmm.
characters' faces that they're standing in a studio with a screen behind them. It's like, could they not figure out natural lighting inside of studios? It would be really nice because it does now become distracting. Back then, I'm sure because it was the norm, nobody
Mm-hmm.
really paid that much attention to it. But yeah, it's like you're in this beautiful, he's there because the next scene you see him and he's like standing on the road and you
Yeah.
see all the scenery around him. So you go, well, why couldn't you film this particular close up in
Mm-hmm.
the same spot instead of going into a studio to do it? Unless maybe they didn't like what they took out on the road and decided to recreate it.
According to some of the trivia I saw, they basically did everything they could in Ireland and then booked it back and filmed every interior shot inside a studio.
Oh, okay.
So
All right.
it is what it is. But so John Wayne explains that his name is Sean Thornton and he's there because that's the cabin that a little cottage that he was born in when Michelino Flynn bounced him on his knee. And Barry Fitzgerald, again, just fantastic performance. He drives him over to the pub called, it's, we would pronounce it as Cohen, but he's like, it's pronounced Kohan here.
Yeah, he gives it. He makes sure that you can get this one right off the bat. I didn't get corrected a lot when I went to Ireland, but I also tried to pay a lot of attention before I went to things that I should know how to say. I didn't get Drogheda until I got home, which used to be where the Irish Parliament was. But since I've been doing my whiskey lore stories, recalling of Irish history along with Irish whiskey history, you can't miss Drogheda because it's
Mm-hmm.
anything medieval up to up to probably the 1700s. It is an important center in Ireland. So yeah, but
I
no.
have to actually make a quick comment. I didn't realize Beyond the Pale until I was reading this was an actual reference to like the Pale was the area of British control within Ireland.
Yeah, because Drogheda was actually inside of it's just north of Dublin. That was inside the Pale. So the idea was that was the English controlled area. And outside that area was basically they had no real influence over it because it was all still Gaelic territory. It was still ruled by more of a pagan uh, set of rulers than it was by and by the Catholics as well. So Ireland has a fascinating history, and it's very complex, but it's well worth diving into.
So John Wayne's at the bar. Now, remind me, has he seen Mary Kate by now? Did they see her on the way there?
Did they do patty cake at the holy water?
Yeah, so that happens. He sees her as a
Oh,
shepherdess
he saw her going down the road.
going down the
He
road.
saw her in the
That's
field.
yeah, that's on the way to the bar, I think.
Yes, that's on the way to
So
the bar.
on the way to the pub, he sees Maureen O'Hara.
Yeah.
Looks amazing in this movie. And dear goodness, casting someone who has, I mean, redhead just instantly
Yeah.
pops on screen, especially against all the greenery around her. She just immediately stands out. And you just see John Wayne's it's like, well, hello there. He's like, am I seeing things? He asked Michelin,
Yeah.
and Michelin's like, it's just an illusion, a mirage brought on by your great thirst.
He's my favorite character in the movie, Flynn. He's everybody needs a Flynn in their life.
Everyone needs a Michelino Flynn, or you become Michelino Flynn.
Yeah, I guess. Yes.
As I'm getting older, so we'll get to the scene, but his drunk acting in this movie is absolutely on point.
Yeah.
So they're at the pub. Everyone's like, who's the stranger? And then you find out, oh, apparently like his family's well known. Everyone's immediately embraces him as he's returned home. And from there, he goes to the cottage. He goes to buy the cottage from the widow Talan.
He has the yeah, that's right. Because I was thinking, when did he have his first confrontation with Will Danaher?
Will Danaher was then at the widow Talan's, and Will Danaher is played by Victor McLaughlin, who is, if I remember correctly, the first supporting Oscar award winner.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Playing the tough guy.
He was 65 at the time of this role and sick.
Was he really?
Yeah.
And got into that big brawling fight.
So there are, in the brawling fight, they actually double his son and John Wayne's son, like every now and again for a few of the shots.
Yeah.
But they had to like be very careful in how they choreographed it.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Actually, as I started watching this movie, and I've done this a lot lately, I got into this weird thing where I was watching old Little House on the Prairie episodes, just kind of a flashback to my youth. And there was a character, Doc Baker, who even when I watch him now, the guy looks like he's probably in his mid to late 50s. And there's one episode where I think it's Ann Archer that he's interested in, and she's like 19 years old, and they're going, everybody's like, you're too old for her, and then I went and looked it up, and he was like 42. And I'm going, okay, well, yeah, for 19 that's too old, but he looks so much older. And it's really interesting that John Wayne doesn't look, I mean, he looks like he's been through life, but he still, looks fresh.
Yeah.
And so I checked his age. He was 45 when he made this movie. Maureen O'Hara was 32. So it's just interesting to put it in perspective.
Yeah.
We think people lived much harder lives, or maybe they were just outdoors a lot more, and so they weathered a lot faster, years and years ago. But you see, it's interesting to see how some people
age extremely well. Linda Carter, who played Wonder Woman in the old 70s show, my goodness, the woman still looks amazing. And she's in her
Cheryl Tiegs
60s,
is another. If you've seen Cheryl Tiegs anytime recently, Cover Girl, she still looks very much like she did. I mean, she looks older, but she only looks a little older.
Tom Selleck, just so we're being bipartisan here, for the men, Tom Selleck still looks pretty darn good, and he just turned 69, I think, or 68.
Yeah, that's true.
I hope to age as well as Tom Selleck.
There you go. Very nice.
So next up, so he meets Danaher. Danaher wants to buy the cottage, White O'Morn, that's the name of it, I think.
Okay.
He wants to buy Whittemore because it's the only piece of land in between his property and the widow Talant's property. And you see, they're so close to an understanding.
Yeah. It's well, not to give the thing away, but you sort of sense that at some point maybe they will come together. But it looks it's like the modern rom-com for those two. Their romance is that it's kind of like two people who look like they're exact opposites will somehow end up together, and it'll work, and you don't know how it works. We cut off the movie before we get to it. They needed a Quiet Man 2. There were too many unanswered questions at the end of this movie.
I would have loved to have seen more of John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara in any time. Anytime.
Yeah.
Give me more of it.
Yeah.
That's the reason they did like 5 films together, I think. Is
Yeah. And
just
and honestly, in 1952, when this was made, they could have gone black and white. This would
Mhm.
not have been the same.
No. So there's a couple of fun facts about this movie. A is the only Oscar winner for Republic Studios, who made the
Okay.
film. They had to John Ford wanted to make this movie. Republic wanted him to make a Western. So they made Rio Grande, which is the film with John Wayne
Ricky
and Maureen
Nelson.
O'Hara. That's
Oh
Rio
no.
Bravo.
Oh, Rio Bravo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Lots of Rios.
I'm bad on my westerns.
But that film is a black and white, quick slap it together. Like they made the movie in like the matter of months.
Yeah.
And there was someone, they even made a comment like on set, wow, it seems like we haven't shot a lot of Indians today, because they were like, it's just we're running and gunning. And John Ford was notoriously like sensitive about some things, and he blackballed that actor from working on his sets again for like
Wow.
years, holding a grudge. Which, for anyone who's watched a John Ford film, you kind of notice he keeps the same cast because he liked working with the same people. The problem with that is if you offended him, you got put into exile. Anyway,
Yeah.
phenomenal film still, but Maureen O'Hara, John Wayne, and it's actually in black and white. This is also one of the first color pictures that Republic made. So
Yeah.
many things were unusual about this film in its making.
Yeah.
So Danaher doesn't end up getting White and Morn. John Wayne gets it. John Wayne goes to the cabin to sleep that night, and McLean Flynn's like, "Are you sure you don't want to come back with me, Sean? It's dark and it's dirty, blah, blah, blah." And he walks in. Who should be there having cleaned White
Yeah.
of Morn for him?
Well, now you've missed the whole part about the in Ireland we don't sleep in the bag. A man does not sleep in the bag. Just some of those little Americanisms and how they were kind of playing off of those things. And the other thing that prior to that is how he would light a cigarette.
Yes.
It reminded me of my youth when cigarettes still could be shown in a movie and some manner of cool could be associated with him. You know, taking a match and striking it off the bottom of your shoe and then lighting and tossing everything out. It's just it's funny because it feels awkward now in a way to see that in a film because you just don't see it anymore. But then for me, because I had seen it in the past, it's like, oh, that's why people thought cigarettes were cool.
I was thinking the same thing. So when we eventually get to the scene where he's doing the walk, he has
Yeah.
that moment where he strikes against his shoe and he like lights the cigarette,
Yeah.
and he just takes like 3 puffs and just throws cigarette away, and he has this really great frustrated look on his face. I'm like, damn, it's a good thing that I know I can't smoke, because otherwise
Yeah.
he makes it look so cool. There's in IMDb trivia, it says there are only 2 moments where he does not just light the cigarette, puff twice, and then throw the cigarette away.
Interesting. The whole thing, because you probably watch Mad Men also.
I haven't seen it in a while, but
Yeah, but I mean, they're smoking constantly in there, but they said they were smoking herbal cigarettes through that whole thing. But I just, man, after a while, that actually turned me completely off of cigarettes. I mean, I'm not a cigarette smoker anyway, but just seeing constant smoke in the air, it's like, oh,
yeah,
geez,
it's
glad I
one of
don't
those
live in
things
that
that
world.
it looks cool for about 0.5 seconds
Right.
until like the detritus of it builds around. You're like,
Yeah.
there are a couple of
So
sitcom episodes that do this that I love it. Anyway,
So why is she in his house cleaning? She's just being neighborly, I guess, or because she is trying to let on that she's interested.
She says she's just being neighborly, but the reality is, I mean, she saw John Wayne and was like, look at this beefcake. Who can
Yeah.
blame her?
Yeah.
So that I think is, she even kisses him as she's leaving, which is very, very not what's supposed to happen. Now, I think that they did Patty Fingers before this.
Right. Yeah.
We also met Father Lonigan, who's played by Ward Bond, who is one of the mainstays of the John Ford cast. Delightful, his Irish accent. He narrates the beginning of the film. And he's like, and so I'll begin at the beginning. Great opening line to a movie.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's an interesting scene for me because again, that takes in that would they be able to make a movie like that now? Because it is that he comes in, still don't know why he threw a rock through his own window.
And he screams too, doesn't he?
Yeah, but then he gets her attention. She's trying to run out the door, and then he grabs her hard and brings her in and kisses her, and it's like, okay, this is
That doesn't happen today.
it doesn't, and it probably wouldn't be acceptable to do that today. But you watch it and you think, again, I think it makes me wonder how younger generations will watch these old movies and think about them, because they would have to be shocking scenes, but to me they're not, because
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in that era. Or if you're watching the old James Bond
Oh
movies,
yeah, like
Thunderball, when he's
Thunderball.
smacking her on the behind, and
Well,
men
in
men talk.
Thunderball, it has that scene where the gal is like, well, I could lose my job if they found out about this. He's like, well, my silence can be bought. You're like, oh no,
Yeah,
no, Sean
yeah.
Connery.
Yeah. So anyway, that whole scene is really kind of interesting because it would be done in a much more subtle way these
Mhm.
days.
Yeah.
The,
It's one of those things where old films, I think, were able to do very broad, quick brush strokes
yeah. Well,
in a way that modern films tended to be a little bit more detailed in some of that kind of work,
yeah.
especially when it comes to the romance of two characters.
There are times in this movie that I feel like, especially the dialogue between Mary Kate and Flynn,
Mm-hmm.
where at points it feels more like a play
Yes.
than it does an actual movie. And it's, I think part of that is because we're so used to, once we got past the method actors, and then really people nowadays, you kind of get lost in the fact that you're watching a movie because they are acting so naturally, and there's a little bit more of that theater acting that
Mm-hmm.
goes on in some of the older movies.
It's more stagey, but
Pronounced, yeah.
with a this is what I tend to think with those films and those eras. The actors that really did a great job with it were ones that winked at the camera just enough, where
Mhm.
they knew what they were doing and the audience knew what they were doing. Because
Yeah.
like that entire scene, the exchange, in which that's basically the next part in the movie, is when Micheline O'Flynn shows up to the Danaher's to completely soused. He's
Yeah.
like, I'm here for Thorn Shonton.
Yeah.
His drunk acting is on point.
Yeah, he well, and what's funny is that she is willing to let him in to have him drink more, and I think he actually starts sobering
He's
up the
like,
more.
my throat, I keep talking about my throat is so dry.
Yeah, she's pouring. He's like, you have a nice steady hand, and then
And
he
then he
pulls
tips
the
the
glass
bottle.
away. Yeah, and he's
Fire.
pouring it himself. My favorite line though is when they're at the piano and he says, she goes, would you like some water with your whiskey? And he says, I drink my whiskey when I drink whiskey. If I want water, I will drink water. Like, yes, I love that attitude. Go for it.
So and every time he says, uh, Mary Kate Danaher, spinster, she
Yeah.
just like glares at him. Like
Yeah.
she's shocked by this term. So he's the local matchmaker. He set them up together, and it seems like it kind of could work, other than Danaher isn't on board because he really doesn't like John Wayne. And since
Yeah.
he's her brother, he gets to, in their culture and tradition of the time, he's able to basically blackball John Wayne from. And John Wayne's confused by this. He's like, what do you mean? We're still going to get married, aren't we?
Yeah, courting was a mess at that time. But I think the
I'd
um
argue it's always a mess, but
well,
that's
that's true. But I would think that the divorce rate was likely lower then because
Mhm.
nobody wanted to go through all of that mess again.
Yes.
If I have to go through all this getting permissions and all the pomp and circumstance around it, then but I think the other thing that I find interesting about this is that I had seen a movie called Matchmaker years ago, and I don't know if you've seen it or not. It was a late 90s movie with Janine Garofalo, and she's working
Okay.
for a Massachusetts senator who's losing in the race. And so he sends his assistant Janine Garofalo to go find his family in Ireland. And so she ends up in the middle of a matchmaking festival, and so she's having to, try to find this information out, but the local matchmaker is doing everything he can to get her set up. And so, and the one guy who's working the genealogy is like, throwing the name Kennedy out there, and oh, I think we've got something we don't know. And anyway, it goes on and on, but it's a hilarious movie. And this whole idea of matchmakers, there's two matchmakers in town, so they're competing against each other to get everybody lined up with somebody. And so then when I watch this, it's like, oh, okay, so that actually is a thing. And I guess you pay the matchmaker and the matchmaker figures out who to set you up with.
Much like the online dating services of the 90s,
Right. The Irish had it going on long before
which I think the Irish would
Match.com.
argue they've had everything going on long before the rest of us Yanks tried doing anything.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
So from there, the conspiracy is formed. Father
Yes.
Lonigan, Michelino Flynn, and basically, like, that's the other charming part of this. You have a cast of characters that basically all get behind the idea of John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara.
Yeah.
So everyone starts being in on this conspiracy, and the pinnacle of like convincing Danaher to let the two of them get married is the horse race.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an interesting scene because it kind of throws you at a moment where there's also a moment in that where one of the guys says ring. He has a familiar ring to it, and he stresses ring. And so we're starting now to reveal little bits of the mystery of John Wayne again and why he's in this particular place. And then you filter all of that in with Father Lonigan not wanting to lie, but finding a creative way to play a part in all of this. And then the whole drama over whether to put the bonnet up on the stick or not put the bonnet on the stick. And the surprise when her bonnet ends up being the one that just remains behind and nobody takes it, which confuses her because she's not in on the whole
The
thing.
conspiracy, yeah.
Right. So she's like, okay. And boy, she's feisty.
Oh, there's a line where Michelino Flynn is like, that red hair isn't a mistake.
Yeah, it's great.
And in that scene, so when Maureen O'Hara is trying to decide whether or not to put her bonnet up, there are two kids on either side of her. Those are actually John Wayne's kids.
Oh, are they? Okay.
Yeah, one is Patrick,
Patrick? Okay.
and then the other one is his daughter, whose name I can't remember.
Yeah, because Patrick showed up in some of his later movies
Mm-hmm. As an
and
actor.
yeah, and I think there was a point where he may have done a film or two on his own as well, but never took
Mm-hmm.
it off. I think it's interesting too. Sometimes I like to bounce around when I'm talking about things, but you were talking about, how many films that they did back to back, or how they tried to squeeze in doing two films back to back. Man, go back and look at John Wayne's career when he was in his 20s doing spaghetti westerns. I
Oh,
mean, four,
he.
five, six, seven, 8 movies a year.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of them, I guess he was in the silent era, right at the tail end of the silent era.
At the end of the silent era and just the beginning of talkies, it was the
Yeah.
point where he was transitioning into just going from being just a, because he was just like a stage, not an extra for a lot of early stuff, and then was transitioning into speaking parts.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the Big Trail is like the first like big John Wayne vehicle, because that was the first one where he's branded as John Wayne. And then after that, he kind of went back to the B pictures into
Yeah.
purgatory until eventually John Ford gave him the graciousness of being in Stagecoach.
Okay. Yeah. I need to dig a little deeper in. John Wayne is one of those actors that because he, and I can put other actors that I really like that are in this category, that every movie you see them in, they're kind of the same actor.
Yeah.
Whereas you got Tom Hanks, sometimes you just get lost in the roles he's in, and he becomes whoever he is supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be in that
Gary
movie.
Oldman's the same. Like the genuine like chameleon like actors.
Yeah, exactly. But then you get John Wayne, and you just figure every movie you're going to get John Wayne. It's his brand, and he's going to pull that off. Um, Side note, also on that, I had heard a long time ago that, uh, and I've forgotten his last name, Terrance Young,
Mm-hmm.
when he was working with Sean Connery on how to become James Bond. Um, the initial thought was that Sean Connery brought on kind of this John Wayne-ish kind of
Mm-hmm.
swagger to him, or could.
Mm-hmm.
And Terrance Young said, "No, I want somebody who walks cat-like. Don't
Mm-hmm.
walk with a heavy heel. Walk cat-like." And so now, when I watch John Wayne movies, I always watch his. I'm paying attention to how he has that swagger, and how he carries himself that way.
John Wayne looks like he can be a bruiser who just is going to go through anything,
Yeah, yeah,
which
exactly.
is appropriate for his role in this film. So the conspiracy has been successful. They've convinced Danaher that the only reason the Widow Talan has not succumbed to his obvious charms is because Mary Kate's still at the house. And if Mary Kate got married,
Right.
things would progress with the Widow Talan. And Barry Fitzgerald, Michelino Flynn, as the matchmaker, is like, oh, yes, absolutely. And Danaher turns to the priest. He's like, Father Lonigan, is this true? And he's like, it might be. He just, I
He's always
haven't
on the
heard
fence.
different.
I can't be committal here.
And
Yeah.
then when Danaher leaves, Michelino Flynn's like, so what do I need to do to pay penance, Father? And he's like, say 5 Hail Marys or something along those lines.
And so he just blurts them out at one point, and the father looks at him like, "Oh, we've done the deed."
And so then they get married. It seems like it's going to be happily ever after. Other than Danaher is not a man to let the grass grow beneath his heels. At the wedding of his sister and his new brother-in-law, he announces that he and the Widow clan will soon be wed.
And is she not shocked?
The look on her face is so amazing. Just this.
Yeah, yeah. An interesting thing about this point in the movie is that, like, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, the actual event has
Mhm.
occurred in the middle of the film.
Yeah, in the midpoint.
And now we are walking into another plot. It's evolving from one plot into another plot at that point. And it's really interesting because when you have a 2-hour movie, if you're following just one plot all the way through, or you got a plot and a subplot, it can drag out a
And it
bit.
doesn't feel like it drags out. Like The Quiet
No.
Man actually feels like I have watched hour and a half movies that feel so much longer than this.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So now, is this the point of the where he gets hit? This is the point where
Yes.
Will Danaher decks him.
Mm-hmm.
Now the story is revealed, because we see him now
Flashback.
knocking the guy down in the ring as as his what was his name? Trooper Thorne.
Trooper Thorne.
Yes, Trooper Thorne. And this is a point in the movie. It's not overly frustrating because I like where this movie goes, but I kind of get tired of that cliche of um
Tragic
people
backstory.
people won't talk to each other. they
Yeah.
they have to keep a something inside, and so it creates all this crazy drama, and you're like, just tell them. Because I keep going, why don't you just tell your wife that you used to be a boxer and that you killed a man in the ring, and that's why you don't care about money, and that's why you don't care about, and that's why you don't want to hit somebody, because you're afraid you're going to kill them. Gee, in just a couple of seconds we would have turned this into an hour-long movie. And they would have lived happily ever after. But the second plot has to start growing here, which is all built out of the fact that we know now what his background is, but she is still in the dark. And to the end, does he ever tell her that he was a boxer and that this is the reason why he had an issue with the mind? This is why I say there's so many unanswered questions from the
Yeah.
Quiet Man. We need the Quiet Man too.
At the end of this, I'll ask you questions on whether or not you should think there should be a remake. And so in this, he's gotten hit. Basically, Danaher is not willing to give up any of Mary Kate's stuff because she had an inheritance from her father of 35 pounds, something like that, and then in gold, and then all of like the stuff in the parlor is hers.
Furniture. It was like 300, wasn't it? I think she had
Yes,
like
300.
$300. Her dowry was like 300
300 pounds,
pounds. Yeah.
which also I looked up the info on IMDb. According to it, that's roughly in today's inflation the equivalent of $23,000.
Okay.
So it's not an insignificant sum.
Right.
And there actually is a moment when she's like listing off her assets to Micheline as a part of like the marriage negotiation. He's like, "Oh, you're a well-propertied woman. I wouldn't mind taking a stab at you myself."
Yeah, I love that. After he's left the whiskey bottle down at his feet and he's forgotten where the whiskey
He
bottle
forgot
is.
where it was. And he like picks it up and takes it with him into each room. Oh, it's again, Barry Fitzgerald. This movie is amazing.
Yeah.
So she does not get any of her stuff. They go back to the house, and there is one of those incredibly like dramatic moments where they're arguing about this because he's like, who cares about the stuff? We have each other. She's like, but you don't understand. Unless I have my stuff, you don't have me. And it becomes very clear she has no intention of being in the same bed as John Wayne that night.
Right.
The moment that she slams the bolt on the bedroom while he's on the other side of the door, he literally was in the process of like, he lit the match like on the timber.
Yeah.
Lit it, had the cigarette, all of a sudden the bolt goes, and all of a sudden it like the music goes that done, and he just tosses it. He like waits for just a second and then breaks down the door.
Yes, and then forcefully throws himself upon her, and then where we think this could really go bad, he just throws her down on the bed and walks out.
He says, he has that great line, there'll be no locks, bolts, or doors between you and me, Mary Kate, except for the ones in your own mercenary little heart.
Yeah, that's oh man. Yeah, that's quite a line.
Such a great line. And then so he throws her on the bed breaks, and the next morning he sleeps in a sleeping bag. Which, can I just say, like, I hate sleeping bags, but for whatever reason, when John Wayne's just sitting there like in his sleeping bag, just upright, lighting his first cigarette of the day, I'm just like, that actually looks comfortable and cool. Yeah. Somehow.
Well, I have to admit that once the furniture got in the house, it looked a lot nicer. It looked very cold and empty.
Mm-hmm. Very Spartan.
Yes, it did. So she was right to want her dowry, but boy, talk about high maintenance.
It's one of those things where, quite honestly, I have to say, like, I don't think that I could handle that much. Anyway, so they get her stuff because there is a different movie. Like, there's a whole section of this movie I would have loved to have seen, which was all of John Wayne's buddies drinking and forcing Danaher to give them the stuff.
Yeah.
Because you know that had to have been like a long, drawn out process. Because basically they show up the next morning with the wagon load of all of her things from the parlor. And they're like, we threatened to burn his house down. Like, sorry though, we couldn't get the money. Even Father Lonigan tried, and it didn't do any good. But everyone's still completely drunk. Mickeline's like hanging on the end of it, and they like set down a chair and then lift him down and set him on the chair, and he just sits there.
We actually missed my favorite Flynn drunk moment.
Which one?
We have passed it by. When he is doing his matchmaking and he's been following the two of them, and then they see the bike and he's like, "Can you ride the bike?"
Courtship moment.
Yes, and so they go off riding on the bike, and he's got his horse going full speed, and all of a sudden the horse just stops, and he's in front of Cohan's bar, and he's like, "You have more sense. You got more sense than I do."
There's another fun fact with that segment too, which I can't believe we missed, is the castle scene. They get caught in the rain and kiss dramatically. Yeah. And John Wayne is not wearing an undershirt.
Right.
And the rain comes down. So this moment, and then a couple of years, like 10 years later in Marnie, the same thing happens where Sean Connery is getting soaked and doesn't have an undershirt on. Apparently, this was a trope that became so annoying to the undershirt companies. They actually like paid for, in another movie, like Rock Hudson or whoever the male actor of the time was, for that scene, him wearing an undershirt. They didn't even care if it was theirs. Wow. They just needed, because sales were plummeting.
Wow.
Because, John Wayne doesn't wear an undershirt with his dress shirts. Why should I? Valid question.
It is a valid question. But, another thing strikes me about that, and maybe I need to watch more John Wayne movies, but this is really the only time I can remember seeing John Wayne in a romantic scene where it was just, he is that it is, this is for the ladies kind of thing.
Because I'm trying to think through, I've watched a lot of John Wayne movies. I don't believe there's any, this is really the only one where there's that really strong romantic plot to it, where all the other ones, if there's a romantic plot, it's kind of like McClintock, where he's older and already married.
Yeah.
There isn't that scene is like the romance cover moment in the water, in the rain.
Well, and it showed that he could do that kind of a scene, which I think is impressive and really stretches him out as an actor, because sometimes you do get typecast, and being in your 40s, by the time you really become a successful movie actor, it could be seen that you're way past time in that era to be doing romantic film leads. And so it's a very brief moment, but it is definitely a moment where you go, okay. And the shirt actually lends to that, because you see kind of you think he's kind of muscly under that shirt, and this is his manly moment being softened a bit by the rain kind of metaphor going on. So it's interesting to me to watch that scene in a deeper dimension than probably what it may have even have been intended to
for.
be.
Yeah. It's a great moment. So when they deliver the stuff to the cottage, there's the baby, that little baby cradle,
and then she freaks out.
And he's like, well, put it in the bedroom. He's like, I don't know where else to go with it. And Michelina O'Flynn carries it in, and they have like, I didn't realize they do actually have like a pause. There is a scene where they explain how they got the stuff and they couldn't get the money in between. But Micheline walks into the bedroom, and can I just say that is my favorite Micheline moment, because he sets down the cradle, he looks at the broken bed, and he goes, impetuous Homeric. And I did not realize this until I was looking over the IMDb, and I'm actually looking up specifically this because I want to make sure it's correct. So he stares at the broken bed. He says, impetuous Homeric. Then if you play close attention, you will see immediately after he says Homeric, the film quickly jumps. This is because the rest of the line was the power of the man, but it was cut after the film's initial release because of the implication of sexual activity, even though the characters were married.
Yeah.
And I love that there was more to that line, and
Yeah.
it's funny because the look of just sheer
Like,
shock on his face.
yeah. Well, the funny thing is, 1952, this was the beginning of the I Love Lucy run, and if they showed beds,
Mm-hmm.
they had to show two separate beds. They were so sensitive to that
Which
whole
is
concept back then.
amusing because literally the angle that this film hinges on at this point is the fact that she wasn't going to let him do anything at that point.
Yeah, yeah. But it's interesting because if you watch, she's wearing something in the scene when he's doing his digging and they're talking about manure and all of that. That's a very revealing, even though it's covering her completely, it's a very revealing kind of a shirt that she's
Mm-hmm.
wearing.
Yeah.
And you're like, it's interesting because it's like they subtly wanted
Censors,
to bring it into your subconscious without actually revealing anything.
which admittedly, I have to say, I think that there's more craft that they got to use at that point because much like we said, other things with storytelling, the more limitations you put on it, the more creative you tend to be. Like
Yeah.
even down to the fact that it isn't in this film, but like back in the old films with a lot of the noirs, smoking was an indication that they had gone to bed together.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, little things like that were film tropes that they created because they couldn't do the things that they do in modern movies.
I have to go look for the list again, but there was actually in me doing my whiskey history research, I bumped into you'll hear things like didn't suffer fools easily. And there were actually lines that were used to help you understand without insulting the person who just died in an obituary that they either had a crabby personality or they didn't have any friends but they would say it in such a nice and pleasant way, and those terms still float around our vernacular today. We just don't know where they came from, but they
Mm-hmm.
actually came out of newsprint and obituaries with the idea of let's say this, let's get our point across, but only insiders will really understand what it is we're talking about here.
We're giving the cues, but
Yeah,
we're not going to say it directly.
exactly. So you had to be a lot more subtle back then. Today we can hit everything with a hammer, and you know it's fine. Say whatever you want to say. It's all open up. And in a way, that's why I think about a movie like The Searchers, and I think of that violent scene that we didn't
Mm-hmm.
see, and think, I wonder if there's a director who would be smart enough to utilize that technique again, because um, I had heard this growing up. They said the French always felt that the reason they had nudes, but they wouldn't show women in lingerie, is because they said it is actually the imagination that is more dangerous than actually showing the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if our filmmakers didn't weren't so lost in where we are now, and they started getting a little deeper into the psychology of it all, we might see some of those techniques come
Mm-hmm.
back, making things much more to your imagination.
I think James Mangold is one of the directors that might be in that category
Mm,
because so he's the one that did Ford v Ferrari and Logan are like two of the bigger movies that he's directed
uh,
within the past
okay.
however long. He also did what's the film? He's currently the director for Indiana Jones 5.
Oh, okay.
So I mean he's a solid director. I heard someone compare he's the modern Howard Hawks in a lot of ways
Okay.
because he's also done rom-coms.
Ah,
He just he takes a movie, he makes a good movie, and he has a very practical set of skills that he does for that. Anyway, tangent movie
yes.
talks.
Always
Uh,
good on tangents.
so they have at this point is clear Mary wants him to ask for the money. He gets her like the little buggy to
Right.
ride with the
Right.
horse.
Really, really nice, thoughtful gift.
Yeah. He
I,
again,
I he's trying.
he's trying.
He just, it's like But there's a line early on in the movie where where Flynn says, all Americans are millionaires, or
Yes.
something to
He's a
that.
millionaire like all the Yanks.
Yeah, like all the Yanks. And you hear that and you think, okay, this is another thing where maybe we as Americans watch this movie, and an Irish person would watch this movie from that era, and we would be watching it through two different filters, getting two different messages out of it, because we would be sympathizing with our known mannerisms, and
Uh-huh.
they would be doing the same. So they're looking at us like, oh, you're all millionaires, and throwing your money around doesn't really impress us. And he's coming into this movie going, money's not important, and he's taking it from a completely, it's two people not seeing eye to eye because of their backgrounds,
Hmm.
and because of how either events that happen to them, they can't see that, or she can't see that, he had a trauma, and that trauma is the reason why he doesn't care about money, and he can throw it lavishly around, and they just see that as, you're just throwing money around, now you're just
You're
showing
being
off,
wasteful.
you're
The
being
the
wasted.
the
Yeah.
moment when he's planting rose bushes and she's like, "Oh, you should be growing potatoes or something like that."
Potatoes and turnips. Yes, exactly.
I,
So
I also
yeah.
love that he makes the comment. He picks up a rock and he's like, "Now I see why you guys have all these stone walls everywhere."
That maybe that's why my dad liked that movie, because when we moved from Michigan to North Carolina into the mountains, I remember him saying, move into the mountains, you can't grow anything here, it's all rocks. Maybe he was sympathizing with that particular moment.
So they go to Castletown and he gives her the beautiful gift. They get there, and what is his wife's actual plan? Not for them to have a nice romantic day together. It is, my brother just sold the yearlings. If you ask him, he's got the money on him, and he's like,
Stop it,
still
woman,
stop.
stop it, who's in charge here?
And can you imagine? She does not take kindly to that reaction,
Right.
so she leaves him. And the joke was at the beginning, before they even left. Again, I love how it sets up these little setups for payoffs.
Yeah.
He's like, she says we could walk, and he's like, oh, well,
We know it's five
no,
miles
we know
now.
it's
Yeah.
5 miles.
Yeah.
It's a
Fine.
good stretch of the legs, yeah.
Yes.
And so she leaves him, and then he has to walk back.
And he's not happy about it.
The expressions on John Wayne's face as he's going along, and he like the moment he picks up the stick and breaks it over his leg.
Right.
And the music is doing the St. Patrick's Day thing, which is dun 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 dun. But during that walk scene, it's like the dun does get sharper and deeper.
Yeah.
So you can tell like his building frustration at the situation.
But somehow he ends up back in the pub.
Mm-hmm.
He's back at Cohan. So
He
how
goes back to
did
Cohen's.
it's like he walked a certain distance and then just gave, but this gives us that opportunity for that absolute beautiful scenery
Mm-hmm.
that really kind of shows off the valleys and the lake. And that lake is right by where I drove, I believe, that where I was just like, wow, this is incredible
Gorgeous.
scenery through there. Yeah. And it's a very Irish area. And when I say Irish, a lot more of the road signs are in Irish,
Gaelic.
Gaelic. Yeah. And this is something I learned since I've been diving deep into this. They prefer Irish. They
Okay.
just call it the Irish language, don't call it
Irish
Gaelic.
language.
And it's interesting because previously I was traveling in Scotland, and in Scotland, it's Gaelic, not
Gaelic.
Gaelic, but they prefer for you to call it the Scottish language rather than
Hmm.
calling it Gaelic. So anyway, that's
Which
that.
I think is fair. Do we, because I mean the joke even it well, no, that's a different historical thing. Anyway, moving on, moving on. So
Okay.
he goes to Cohen's, and there he talks to Danaher. Danaher has again just he's like, you want the money, don't you? And he's like, I don't care. They all are obsessed over it. He's like, you're gonna fight me. You want to fight me for it. And someone says, you got 60 pounds on him, Danaher. And he's like, what if I put one, pick the fist? I'll put one behind my back.
This is so old school.
And John Wayne he looks like he's trying, and he like slaps his fist and walks out.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Mary Kate has talked to Father Lonigan, who is trying so hard to get this fish. He's staying there fly fishing, and it's the big one.
Was it the trout that's this long? Remember that at the beginning of when he's at the train station at the very beginning, they're asking him if he's going fishing, trout fishing, and get one this big.
You can get one this big. Again, little things where they set up that fishing is a pastime here. That's a regular thing. They do such a great job building the world of Ireland for someone who has never seen it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the scene where Father Lonigan, the Mary Kate asks if she can tell him what's going on. And she's like, I don't feel comfortable saying it in English. Do you mind if I say it in the old tongue? And he's like, whatever. Because he just wants, he's focused on the fish. And she's explaining what happens. And again, this is a good way of being able to go around the censors for what they want her to be saying. And Father Lonigan, like, you see the expression on his face. He's like, Ireland may be God bless her, is a poor country, but in his country, a man sleeps in his bed, not in a bag.
Yes, I love that line. I remember those old sleeping bags. My parents had those that were rolled up inside of a bag inside a bag kind of thing, and they were never comfortable.
I have decided that I hate camping, and I don't believe in staying anywhere where there can't be a mint on my pillow.
I think this is a good sign that you're not a camper. If you like to wear a tie a lot, you would prefer, because I've said that same thing. I am definitely not a camper. I camped some when I was a kid with my parents, and I just did not enjoy the experience at all. And when I travel, my brother and we're complete opposites. My brother stays in hostels. I wouldn't go anywhere near a hostel. And my thing is, his is saving money. He wants to, and I get the one thing he talks about where he says, you're kind of around a community of people and you can chat with people and you can get to know people. Whereas in the hotel, you don't get that. And I said, well, this is why when you're in Europe, you go to bed and breakfasts, because you get the same experience. You can go downstairs and there's a common area and you can chat with people. And I love that. But I can also be wearing a tie while I'm chatting with them, and nobody thinks, well, the ties are unusual these days, but they still don't think you're, wacky coming in your tie. They'll just ask you about it. You come in from a business trip, did you? No. This is just what I do. It is how I am.
There's just my parents. They're like, we went camping all the time when you were a kid. How do you not love this? I'm like, because we went camping all the time when I was a kid. Ask and answer your question.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, when some people look at the woods and, I can look at that beautiful scenery, but if you zoom in a little bit, all I see are bugs.
Yes, exactly.
Like, I just don't want to deal with them.
So when the Duke gets home, Mary Kate hands him a stick to beat her with. Because that's a joke that sets up again earlier in the film, was the idea that, you get a stick to beat the girl with. And he throws it on the fire. He relaxes, and he's about to light a cigarette, and she has the taper ready for him. And it's just such a sweet moment as the two of them are sitting there in front of the fireplace.
With him with a cigarette in his mouth.
With him and his cigarette. And again, he takes 2 puffs.
Yeah. And then throws it away.
Which comment, my dad, who used to smoke, he stopped, I think he quit before I was born. So it's been a long time. But even to today's, when we watch a movie like that, and he's like, that's just so wasteful. You only take 2 puffs. Those things are too expensive to keep throwing away like that.
Yeah, but back then, I remember when we lived in Detroit, so this would have been late 70s. they had cigarette machines that you would go over to, and I remember when they went to $1 and everybody thought a pack of cigarettes for $1, that's absolutely insane. Why would you do that? Now they're like 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever they may be. So no, I get that. And that would definitely be, this is again going back to a different sensibility than modern generations, because they would have come out of the Depression. This film, of course, takes place right before the Depression, so
Yep.
they wouldn't have gone through that. But it still was poor country
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. I mean, Western Ireland, that's where, when the famine happened, it happened in that area and was devastating. And that area took a long time to really recover. So um, that's the reason, and that's why I kind of try to figure out what is the time period of this movie,
Mhm.
because you see buggies, you don't see automobiles at all, but you see a train. Well, then that's
Well, there
19.
is one automobile. The Reverend Playfair, who we haven't talked much about, but he's the one that's been putting together the pieces of John
Yeah,
Wayne's background. And in
right.
fact, so there is a scene where before he gets home to the White and Morn and has that lovely romantic scene with Maureen O'Hara, he's stopped by the Reverend Playfair's and asks, "You're the only one that's figured out what I did, that he was a boxer, that he killed a man in the ring." Because the Reverend Playfair, he's an avid fan of boxing, so he like keeps track of these things. And when he heard the name he heard the word Trooper and then Thorn and then Ring, it started to piece together in his head. And I love how he walks in and the Reverend Playfair and his wife are playing Tiddlywinks. And he's like, "Would you like to play a game of Tiddlywinks?" If there is one game I can never imagine John Wayne playing, it's Tiddlywinks.
Yeah, Tiddlywinks was always a joke in my. I don't know. My dad would throw it out there whenever he thought you were doing something that was of no use to the world. So Tiddlywinks, you playing a game of Tiddlywinks. Uh,
And that's when Reverend Playfair encourages him that, you know what? I know that this is what happened, but to keep your wife, you might have to actually get ready to fight again. And then he is about to offer him a drink, and he goes, "I suppose you won't be taking one because you're in training
you're
now."
in training, and then he pulls out his own picture of when he was. Now, what was interesting was he pulled that picture out, and then John Wayne goes, "That that must have been from 19." and
Oh, the
then
year
and
doesn't matter.
and then they cut him off. Well, if this took place in the 1920s, that would have
Yeah.
only been,
I,
10, 15 years earlier. So it's kind of an
yeah.
awkward from a time
I was thinking
period
the same
standpoint.
thing. I was
Yeah.
like, wait a minute. I know the story's supposed to be set just in like early 1920s,
Well,
which
and
means really there isn't.
there's only one clue as to when this takes place, because Flynn talks about you Americans and your prohibition.
Yes.
So that is how we know it had to
Prohibition.
be 1920s. Yes. Yeah.
No, it's
So,
it is one of those moments. Admittedly, I think I like that they don't put a specific time because the film feels so timeless
right. Yeah.
in the way it does. But I caught that too when I watched it last night. I was like, wait a minute, because 10 years, that isn't too far back.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he was like the lightweight, featherweight champion. And
Yeah.
they show the picture, and it's Reverend Playfair, who's a like very, very small, anemic sized man doing the classic boxing pose.
Yeah. And then John Wayne kind of mimics it.
All right.
Yeah, exactly. So,
So when John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara have their lovely evening together, and the Duke wakes up, and he has one of those moments that's just so funny. Like he gets up and he's swaggering through the cottage. He walks over to the flowers, leans down, takes a deep
he,
breath, and goes, "Woman of the house."
because he thinks he's got it going on. He
He
thinks
thinks
he's
that,
finally settled all this crap, and he is into regular married life because they had a very nice evening.
and Micheline is sitting outside his door. "She's not here, Sean. She's ashamed of you, ashamed of herself." And John Wayne's just like, "Got to be
Yeah,
kidding."
here we go. Drama continues. Thank you. I have done everything in my life to try to pull as much drama out of my life as I possibly can. So I watched this movie through that filter, going, oh man, how much of this could I really take? I mean, this guy really wants this woman.
There are so many moments. The boxing allegory actually works really well for this movie
Yeah.
because he doesn't realize he's getting into a ring of a different sort.
Yeah.
And so he finds out McLean took her to the train. Of course, I'm like, buddy, McLean, be a bro. Don't take her to the train station.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, he had taken her to a train station. So McLean's there.
Yeah, but
And
they're like, this train is 4.5 hours delayed. Why are we holding up? So it was all plotted out too, that they were going to make sure that she didn't get out of town before he had a chance to confront. So it felt like a big setup that we just weren't
privy
privy
to.
to. Yeah.
When he gets to the train station, there's that wonderful moment where she sees him. She like hides in her train car, and he goes down each and every train door and just slams it. And this is still that time where musical cues were kind of also sound effects, and so it does that wonderful thung thung with the music as he's going down the thing until she's like in the second to last coach,
Right.
and then he
You know,
drags her back.
this is music that was emulated in the Dr. No movie. I always have to go back to
We have to go back to James Bond.
my favorite scene in that movie. You think of all the great scenes in that movie. My favorite scene is when he has the tarantula on him,
Yes.
and then he knocks the tarantula off, and he's like, and the orchestra is like doing the hits right along with him. He has to hit it one more time just to make sure.
What's amazing is to see, so in Dr. No 2 from Rush with Love, which is the first and then second of the James Bond franchise, just seeing how evolved the soundtracks became.
Mm.
Because it was like from 60 to 62, 63, I think. No, 62, because then Goldfinger was 63. So just in like the space of a year, 2 years, soundtracks radically changed in how they
Yeah.
were used in a movie.
Yeah. This was
This one was 54, I think.
50, yeah, 52.
52. So
52. So,
this
yeah.
is a decade before James Bond, which is shocking because I honestly think this film has aged better than Dr. No. Like in terms of just general appearance,
Yeah.
atmosphere, even the pacing of the film.
Yeah.
I think that it's a much more,
Well,
I hesitate to say well edited, but it feels quicker.
you had a director in that particular case that was who had done movies with vast scenery and really kind of creating space in movies, and so it's paced well. Whereas I think with Dr. No, Terrance Young was much more of a personality and what's going on in the moment and looking at the characters and really kind of drilling in on them rather than taking in the world as a whole on top of them. And maybe that more focused approach forced the pacing along. I sense in the you feel like from Russia with Love they figured out what they were going to do, but
Yeah.
prior to that, it was Dr.
They're
No
still
feels
figuring
like
it
they were
out.
playing a bit, trying to figure it out. Yeah.
So if the cross section of people that listen to this podcast have no idea how lucky they are that we have both the James Bond on one side and then the Quiet Man on the other, and somehow we have found a way to cross over those two topics.
It all goes back to James Bond.
It all goes back to James Bond. It's like the center of the suit up universe.
Yeah.
And so he drags her back. Now, couple of quick fun facts about this. I read that apparently John Ford and John Wayne like kicked all of the sheep dung that they could find into the path that he'd drag her down.
So she would slide.
So she would slide. Not that wasn't the reason. It was just to mess with her. But I don't know how true that fact is. But I do know I've heard this in the different like making ofs. John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara were told, we're not going to rehearse this. We're going to do first take. We're going to figure it out. John Ford was very insistent. We're going to get the real naturalness of this. Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne were like, we're not gonna just. So they the day before did the whole thing, and even down to like the dropping of the shoe was
Okay.
something they choreographed and planned. So
Yeah.
then when they did it and the whole shoe thing happened, John Ford's like, see, you couldn't have gotten that if you had rehearsed it. It was so perfect, so spontaneous. And
Yeah,
they're like, yes, Pappy.
exactly. We'll humor you on this. Well, it's an interesting technique to hear that and hear the director would do that. I don't. Did you ever watch the show MASH?
Yes.
So one of the chilling moments in that series is when Colonel Henry Blake's plane is shot down and radar has to go in and give the information. When they did the filming of that, they did not rehearse it, and nobody knew what the end of the film, what the end of the
Episode.
episode was going to be. And radar was handed William Berghoff was handed the um, script or the line that he had to read or the paper that he had to read and pushed through the door and had to deliver it, and nobody knew what he was going to say. You got 100%
Real.
actors,
Yeah.
real reactions rather than, because nobody saw that coming. And so, I mean, the power behind that. So I can understand why somebody, and interesting to hear that like a John Ford would even consider doing something like that to try to get the most natural reactions as possible. I just want to know how much extra Maureen O'Hara had to be paid to have her arms yanked out of her sockets for this long. I mean, that goes on, and he's dragging her. I mean, it's not a easy scene. Yes, maybe there's some sheep dung to make it a little easier, but I don't know if that would make it actually easier or just
More
another.
friction.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a scene that when you watch it, you're kind of like, wow, okay, they really went on with that one for a while.
And the entire everyone from the Castletown uh, train station is following them as
Yeah.
this is happening. Train is those poor people that were like waiting for mail for the train that just everyone leaves that's supposed to be running it.
Yeah.
Train probably went cold, lots of
Fight,
issues, I'm
fight.
sure. And
Father Lonigan
Flanagan,
hears about the fight, and he's like, why didn't you tell me?
Danaher and Sean Thornton, he's like, why didn't you tell me? But before we get to that point, they have that moment where the little lady like hands John Wayne the stick. He's like, here's a stick to beat the lovely lady with. And John Wayne's like, thanks. And he still holds it. He drags her to Danaher's, throws her at Danaher, and says, if you won't give me the money, no dowry, no marriage. This is your funky tradition, not mine.
Right.
And Danaher is like, meh. And he like begrudgingly takes out the money in pound notes, throws it at the ground. There you go. There's your dirty money. And John Wayne picks up, and what I love is Maureen O'Hara's the one that like opens the furnace
I didn't really pay attention to
door
that. Okay,
on the
yeah.
binder thing.
Yeah.
And he looks at her and she nods, and he just throws the money in there.
Oh wow. Yeah, see, I wasn't watching to that. I remember that the first time I watched the movie, apparently I didn't pay attention to the fact. I was so caught up in what was going on with the drama that I didn't notice that he had thrown the money into the fire. And so second time, this is why you watch a movie a second time. Because you'll start picking up on things you didn't notice the first time because you're not chasing the plot. You're now really digging in and
taking the
paying
details.
attention to why is this stuff going on? Oh, okay. I get it. Yeah.
And then she says, I'll have supper ready for you when you come home.
Only after the punch.
Oh, that's right. That's
Remember? He
after.
hit him in the gut. And when he hit Will
Yeah.
Danaher in the gut, she turns to him and goes, I will have dinner for you when you get home. And I'm like, that's so funny. That and the fact that this fight is just the play between the two of them, because you can see they're beating the crap out of each other, but that especially the Irishman is not going to lose this fight. Yet they're in the pub together taking a break, and he's like, I'm really getting to like you. And then next thing you know, they're back punching each other again.
In the fight, the fight is like the last 9 minutes of the movie. They originally, Republic said it could only be 2 hours. And so they cut and cut and cut and cut. They couldn't get it under 2 hours and 9 minutes. So what they did was when they were showing the Republic executives, they cut it off at 2 hours at just that moment. And then they're like, wait, the fight, what happens? Because it just literally like builds to this is going to be the fight and then cut. They were like, okay, fine. You can have the extra 9 minutes just so we can finish this.
Which is funny because the movie is 2 hours and 9 minutes long.
Uh-huh.
So the fight, it takes up the entire, they said you can have the fight. I guess they took them at their word. And back then they didn't have rolling credits at the end of the movie. So basically once you're done, you're done. But I think the whole thing too of Flynn taking bets through this whole thing and trying to keep up with it. And that this other subplot about the bishop coming into town and they only have 2 or 3 parishioners coming to his services. Yet somehow
for the Church of England, just for clarification for people watching at home, Church of England, by legal requirement, basically of the crown, was the official church religion. And so even though the Catholics obviously had more people, they still had to have this guy around. But if he didn't have enough parishioners, they might have reassigned the Reverend Playfair.
Yeah. So, but in the end, when the vicar's wife comes back in, she says something about I'm so sorry I lost such and
3
such pounds.
I lost 3 pounds to the widow Tolan.
And then the bishop is like, here's your 15 pounds or whatever.
He says, here's your 15 pounds, Snuffy. Because apparently they knew each other from like college or something, so they're friendly. And then his wife just gives him like the greatest look in the world. She's like, you turd. She's just like, I'll have tea for you, Snuffy.
Yeah, that's great.
And so in the fight scene, they just say Marquis of Queensberry rules, and it's kind of like another version of the Dragging of Marine O'Hara, where this fight just like moves across the landscape until it arrives to Cohen's pub. And throughout the entire thing, we're seeing all these little side characters who we've been introduced to in the film talking about, oh, the fight's happening. What should we do? The police are like, what should we do? And they like gets off. What do you say? He's like, put 15 on Danaher. Showing that the first instinct of every good Irishman is to try taking bets in the situation and then get a drink afterwards. And Father Paul, who's like the younger of the priests, walks up to Father Lonigan. He's like, there's a fight in town. And he's like, should I stop it? And he goes, yes, it's your duty, as he's like trying to catch this fish again.
Yeah.
And he's like, it's Danaher and Sean Thornton. He's like, oh, why didn't you tell me? He throws down the fishing reel and they run over. And because he's supposed to have stopped it, he doesn't go around the rock like wall. He just kind of looks over and they're like, shouldn't we put a stop to this, Father? Yes, we should. He's like, his arms are like, yeah. Such a great moment.
Yes.
And then the guy who's dying, there's
that's my favorite. Yeah, they're all like mourning this guy passing, and it looks like he's not going to make it the next moment. And then it's like he hears that there's the fight going on and the crowd coming down the street, and he just perks right up and gets out and throws his pants on and walks out to watch it.
One of the greatest comedic moments is him trying to like literally pulling his pants up as he is like running down the road.
Yes.
That was, I believe, Francis Ford was his name. He's the older brother of John Ford.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it was like a little cameo there.
Interesting.
He was a silent film star back in the day, and actually was one that brought John Ford to Hollywood.
And thus the reason he would know the comedic ability of a visual gag rather than having to say anything. So,
and we get to the end. They're in the bar. They're having like their timeout, and they are arguing over who gets to pay for the drinks. The guy's like, they're on the house. You don't have to pay for them. They're like, well, I'll pay for my money. And then they have that moment. He's like, how long has it been? And he's like, it's been a minute. And he's like, okay. And then he does one gigantic uppercut.
Yeah.
That flattens Victor McLaughlin. Literally just breaks through the front of the pub, through the door. And then it cuts to them drunk as anything, walking into White-Amorn, arm in arm, literally. And Mary Kate is like just so happy, and she's getting them food and everything. And that's basically the end of the story, other than Playfair, to keep him around while the bishop like drives out of town. They Father Lonigan, who is the rival religious leader in this town, I'd like to point out, he likes the guy. So what he does is he has all of the parishioners, the entire town, like cheer like good Protestants, and he and Father Paul like put bandanas around their collars and like yep yep hooray, yep yep hooray. And that's kind of the note the film ends on, as then you see like little stills of the different sets of characters, and then it ends on John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara and him holding a stick, and she takes it out of his hands and throws it away, and then he like chases her to the house.
Yeah. Crazy stuff.
An
Crazy
amazing
stuff.
film.
And it's interesting because I guess next time I watch it, I will pay much more attention to the religious side of things. I think there's a part of me that, as I have been doing my research and doing the writings on um, for the Whiskey Lore Stories podcast and trying to tell Irish history, it's like it's really interesting because I feel like I have to tiptoe because it's not a I have to be careful how I tell it because I'm telling it as an outsider, and there's sensitivities on both sides. And there was watching this, they're less now than they used to be. But still, I would say something to the effect of, when this particular Oliver Cromwell was a very difficult point because he was very hard on the Irish. And for me to try to be somewhat even-handed as a whiskey guy who also has English listeners as well as having Irish listeners and Northern Irish listeners, and it's like, okay, I really need to understand this because I could be very insulting if I'm not just giving the facts as I'm telling the story. I didn't get a lot of blowback on it, so I guess I did okay. But I mean, religion is such an important part of Irish culture through that time period and up through the 70s and 80s. It's really interesting now that it's still there, but it's not intense like it was. One of the things that I hear every once in a while from people, they'll say, oh, they have that Protestant and Catholic whiskey thing. If you're drinking Bushmills, you're drinking Protestant whiskey. And if you're drinking Jameson, you're drinking, Catholic whiskey. What's funny about that is that Jameson is actually made with Bushmills juice in it. So, and Jameson juice, Middleton gets sent up to Bushmills when they do their blends. So, and they used to all be the same company at one point. So it's interesting to see all of that and try to work through. That's why I decided when I was doing the podcast that I had to do Irish history along with doing as part of whiskey history in Ireland as well, because you can't disconnect the two. It's such a part of the culture so I will pay more attention to the religious side of this and try to get my brain. I don't have a side. I don't go Catholic or Protestant either way. So it's like they say when you watch sports, you should pick a team because that'll help you really get into the battle. And since I don't really have a side when it comes to religion, it kind of just confuses me, or I ignore it because it's like because I don't get deeply passionate about either side of it. So anyway,
so
fun stuff.
In rewatching this, The Quiet Man, what were your big takeaways from this viewing? So it's the second time you've seen it?
Second time I've seen it, and within 2 months
that
I've seen it twice. So yeah, well, it definitely proves the fact that if a movie is good and of substance, that it's worth seeing a second time because you will pull the layers out of it and be able to really take it from a deeper standpoint. I think what really stood out to me was the romantic scene in the rain, and how that stood out to me this time because I started watching other John Wayne movies afterwards, and it gave me that sense that, wow, this was really kind of a moment for him versus other films that he did. And just I'm reminded of when Last of the Mohicans came out, because
Hmm.
I grew up in the area where that was filmed, and I had moved to Philadelphia, and I lived in Philadelphia when that movie came out, and everybody loved it. And I love history, but I found it boring. I just,
Hmm.
as I watched it, I'm like, this is dragging out. Why are they dragging this movie out so long? And I was talking to somebody, and they said, but the scenery is so incredible. And I went, no wonder. I grew up around that
Yeah.
scenery. The scenery was not impressive to me because it's what I knew. And so I wasn't getting that aspect of the film. And it makes me wonder, if you were Irish and you saw all of that scenery that so impresses me, would you have that? Would you find the movie drags a little bit
Hmm.
because it's spending a little too much time on this run across through the scenery, and the fighting scene is going on and on and on, and it's kind of a showcase again for the scenery of the area and all that sort of stuff. um and when he first comes to town, and the buggy ride in, I could see those as probably being kind of drawn out to somebody who's familiar with that
Hmm.
scenery. um but I mean, it's definitely jumped way up in terms of movies that I enjoy watching. I get why my dad liked it. And for the time period, just a great movie. So
Now, this episode is also coming out around St. Patrick's Day. What are your typical St. Patrick's Day traditions, if any?
aha. Um, used to be, when I was a kid, was going to McDonald's and getting a Shamrock Shake. We don't, it's funny. I don't have any Irish blood.
Okay.
So we never really paid much attention. And I started, my younger years, I was a DJ in a club. So, you know, St. Patrick's Day was a working day. It wasn't really a day to celebrate. And so I've wanted to get more involved in it, but since no tradition ever really developed for me, it's kind of like, just make sure you wear green so you don't get pinched. And that was the only thing I really worried about. What's funny is that my brother and mother had the blood test done for
Hmm.
um, ancestry.com, and
Yeah.
even though our tree, as far as we've drawn it out, doesn't really show any Irish or Scottish background, the blood test does. So
Oh,
yeah,
interesting.
so I don't know, maybe that's but I think the other thing too, and what draws me to Ireland, is that I grew up in the mountains of North Carolina, which is a Scots Irish area. And I
Hmm.
have to tell you, when I was in Belfast, there was a moment I was at a diner having breakfast, and I was just sitting there going, this is really interesting, because I don't feel like I'm in a different country. I feel like I'm home.
Hmm.
And that's a feeling that doesn't come along very often. I also had that feeling when I was in the Czech Republic, which was interesting because that's where some of my family came from. And I'm
Okay.
like, it's personalities and the way people are, even though they're
Hmm.
speaking a different language, you feel a comfort level. And it's weird because, I've never been here before, and the buildings look very different from any culture I've been around before. Yet somehow I feel like I'm at home. And it's a really interesting when you can find a place to visit that feeling comes to you. You start wondering, hmm, is this my DNA down through a time period, kind of reminiscing and saying, yeah, I remember generations back when this was a place I may have stood and looked at things. Who knows? So
Do you think The Quiet Man should be remade or could be remade?
no, no. And I mean, there is an attempt to remake some films that I just question why. There are a lot of TV series that
Hmm.
they've tried to turn into movies, and there have been some that have been successful and that I think that they've done a pretty good job. The Fugitive is probably my favorite in terms of,
Yeah.
but my dad didn't like it. He watched the show and he did not like
Um,
the movie. And so I guess you kind of, I didn't watch the show, so I
Mhm.
didn't get that. Mission Impossible, another series that I didn't watch the show, but I love the movie series, and I think they evolved and they got better. I think the first early ones were not as good as the newer ones, but
First one is a different movie, but it's a good actual spy movie.
yeah,
If you
yeah.
separate out from the rest of the franchise, it's just a straight spy thriller.
I think the thing that turned me off, because I've gone back and I've watched it since, and I enjoyed it watching it because I just dropped everything and said, let me just watch it and see, because I've kind of avoided it for a long time. It has great actors in it, and I think the reason why I didn't like it when I first saw it was the same reason I didn't like Quantum of Solace when I first saw it. You felt like you were lost a lot. It's like,
Mm.
why is this going on? I'm
It's
not.
not clear A
Yeah,
plus B
there was an assumption in Quantum of Solace
that you had seen the
that
last movie.
everybody had seen the last one. Well, I had seen the last one, but it had been so long between movies that I had forgotten plot points. And
Mm-hmm.
so when I went to see Quantum of Solace, I'm like, okay, I mean, we're already in the middle of a movie, and I'm not quite sure and how's all this other stuff working into it. And that's why now I can watch it and I go, some of my favorite Bond scenes are in Quantum of Solace.
It's I think it's the one where Daniel Craig looks the best as Bond,
Mm,
and he has some of his best Bond moments.
kind
If
of
you
like me
take
with I was gonna say kind of like me with Roger Moore and Spy Who Loved Me.
yes,
It's not my favorite Roger Moore film, but he looked like he was in his prime in that movie
mm-hmm.
and settled into the character. Because the earlier movies, he didn't look like he was so settled into the character. He was still kind of
He's still
finding his
playing the
way.
Saint.
Yeah, exactly. But by Spy Who Loved Me, he was like, okay, now I'm here. And and then the plots just started getting weird after that. So it was harder for me to like the Roger Moores after although
For Your Eyes Only is a
that
pretty
that's my
good.
favorite.
That's my
That's
favorite Roger Moore.
because that is the only he actually they talk about the scene where he kicks the villain's car over the cliff.
Mm.
And Roger Moore said, I did not want to do that scene. That's not the type of Bond I want to play. And I thought that was really telling because it's no wonder it went slapstick, and
Mm.
they really embraced that. The only sad part about that movie was he did look past his prime because they put him up against Holly Lynn Johnson, who is
Yes,
and this is his leading lady. It's like, no, this isn't working. You're just exacerbating the problem here of
his
his starting to
age.
look like he's long in the tooth. Yeah,
Oh, so many things with someday we'll do A View to a
yeah.
Kill. It'll be delightful. Drew, thank you so much for coming on the show and
Sure.
talking The Quiet Man with me.
Yeah.
Where can people go to learn more about you and your work? And where can they find your books, Experiencing Irish Whiskey and Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon? Well, Kentucky
Best.
Whiskey is the name of the book, right?
What's that?
It's Experiencing Kentucky Whiskey, right? Or is it
Yeah.
Kentucky Bourbon?
Kentucky bourbon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which is interesting because when I've written since then, I'm like, oh, I'm not just talking about what one type of whiskey. And yes, Kentucky is mostly known just for bourbon. So um, you can find those books on Amazon. That's probably the best place. Booksellers will carry it. If you go in and you ask, they can order it for you. Any bookseller you go into, and then if you can also buy it online. It's on my website, especially in the US at whiskey-lore.com. And there's all the links to all my social media, which I'm on Instagram, YouTube. I do YouTube tastings, and my YouTube tastings are educational. So I don't only teach you how to or tell you what I'm experiencing out of the whiskey, but I give you history and I talk a little bit deeper about whiskey there as well. So that's a good place to catch me. And also I've got a Patreon / whiskey lore as well, where I do extra videos and my episodes out there, and the podcast. You can find, just look for whiskey lore on any podcast app. I'm in a lot of places.
You are in a lot of places, and that's a good thing. Thank
Yeah,
goodness for searchability.
there you go. Absolutely.
And we will link all of that in the show notes. Drew, thank you again for joining us on the show.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. It's always great chatting with you.
And